Thank you very much for joining me today, Eric. Pleasure to have you back on. So,
My pleasure, buddy. Thank you.
last year we had you on just after you finished. No, you were in the middle of your off season in lead up to prep last year, and you'd also just finished writing up the nutrition side of the pyramids, and we're going to talk about the training today. But first of all, I want to ask you what are your plans now with bodybuilding. Like, are you going to compete again this year, or are you going to take another bit of an off season into 2027?
No, I definitely taking an off season. I look at the progress I made from being on stage in 2023 to 2025 and actually being a legitimate 1.5 kilos heavier on stage and potentially at least looking my leanest, which could just been from the muscle gain. You know how bigger muscles push against the minimal fat layer, or just even the skin more. So it could be deceptive as to whether you're truly leaner. But if I put on that amount of muscle from that season, then I think expecting to make reasonable changes at this level of my career, competing back-to-back years, is probably not realistic. And I was right on the cusp of some of my external goals, placing 6th out of 11 in the Pro Open World division at WBF World. So I was like, oh man, I was really sniffing the top 5. So I think I will need the time. So the plans are to take 2026 off from competing and just see if I can put the maximal amount of effort that's successful into it like I did this last time. Just all my chips were already in. I'm just looking to drop a chip on the ground. Or maybe I have some different chips or different strategies I can push forward. So I've been leveraging things like 2-a-days and really refining my nutritional approach, my recovery environment, my sleep. And and just finding better ways to beat the polygraph. That's the main one. I'm just kidding. But yeah, no, so earliest I will compete is 2027. And I am actually open to extending that to 2028 just because I do think, just based on the mere fact that I made the gains I could make, I think I wasn't as quite close to my peak potential as I thought I was. And the closer and closer you get to it, the longer it takes. If I follow the modeling assumptions that we see in the general research science of how do gains come, they follow a linear log model. So that means, like, if it took me 14, 15 months of off season to put on, 4 to 5 pounds of muscle, then it will probably take twice as long to do it again. Or in that same time, I can only make, 2 to 3 pounds of gain, which would be incredible. So if I put on another 2 to 3 pounds, or even half of that, a quarter of the gains I made, I think it would show up on stage and it would be a meaningful difference. But I won't know it until I get there. So basically going to reassess sometime about like 6 to 9 months from now and make a rolling decision there.
I think obviously we're going to talk a bit more about the meat of the conversation in a bit, but I want to stay on this for now. Like, as an advanced lifter, do you now know if you are making gains? Is it only when you get into contest shape, or do you have little signs that you're looking for along the way as you're going through the off season?
There's definitely signs to go along the way. And I think probably the 3rd edition of my books that we're going to talk about, I did the best job of really kind of explaining that in the progression chapter, especially in the nutrition book as well. And kind of like, what does it mean to see progress for body composition? And I think a lot of people, because DEXA is more accessible, because, the in-body BIA scans are more accessible, and these are huge step ups from what we used to do. They're comparable to like dunk tanks from way back in the day. But what people don't realize about dunk tanks is you have to get dunked into a human-sized thing of water and expel all of your air to get an accurate DEXA comparable 2-compartment, lean mass, fat mass thing. So those portable dunk tanks really didn't take off like the portable DEXAs do now, or the in-body scanners and the companies that come and consult at your gym. And what people don't realize is, even though that tech is really good, it's really good for group level inferences. And even when you minimize all error possible and you go to like the best body comp labs in the world, like what we have at the Sports Research Institute New Zealand here with our DEXA scanner, and also having a 3D scanner and ultrasound, or if you go to see, Grant Tinsley out in Texas or Gary Slater out in Australia, they can get it down to 2 to 3% error, but that's huge. I mean, the gains that I'm talking about making, especially over shorter time periods, if I'm going to check along the way, are going to fall within that 2 to 3% margin of error. Even if I wait long enough, like if I just do like a quarterly DEXA scan, the 2 to 3% error doesn't go away. It just means that my change should be bigger than it. But that means it can inflate or it can deflate the relative loss of fat mass or gain in lean mass or whatever I'm expecting to see. So if I only gain 100 grams of lean tissue each quarter, I'm thinking, oh man, that's actually a little less than I'd hoped. But what if I'm actually gaining 500 grams? So it's a real change, but it's masking the magnitude of it. So the things that I do to assess progress and what I recommend others do is to look at performance in the gym while following a sufficiently stable program. And especially on movements that have a low skill component and haven't been recently introduced. You know, obviously if right now, as someone who's done 20 powerlifting meets, but has not competed in a powerlifting meet since 2021, my 1RM squat, if I just literally went into it and just did a study right now and put on the belt and all that, I do have many, many years since 2004 of back squatting. I could probably muster together like 190, 195, maybe a 200 kilo squat if we did a certain number of warm-ups just to kind of get me keyed in, but not enough to fatigue me. But that's a long way off of what my best ever squat is at 227. It's more than a 10% reduction, right? So I'm trained enough to where if I started doing squats regularly, I could see a 10% increase in strength over a couple training cycles, right? I'd get to 220. I've done that many times, right? And that wouldn't at all be reflective of my muscle mass gains. I might even have maybe a slight loss in my rec fem if I started shifting to a fully, powerlifting oriented program. So what I need to look at instead is, what are my historical bests on things like RDL, leg curl, back extension, hip thrust, similar machines, right? What's the most volume I've done across 4 sets on dumbbell bench press, And also realizing that body weight affects things. Like, okay, yeah, my weighted pull-up is only 10 kilos added to my body for 15 reps right now. But when I got 20, did I weigh 86, 87, or was I weighing 84 and it was the middle of the prep? So you want to look for that objective clustering of improvement in performance. And then you also want to look at body weight markers. This is especially helpful for competitors who go all the way up and all the way down to like a peak off-season weight and then a peak condition. And once you've gotten out of kind of that weird recovery phase where water retention's funky, you're eating strange things, your sodium shifts, your meal timing shifts, and your hormonal balance isn't normally, so even your actual fat distribution shifts a bit. Like, oh, what's up with this? I'm storing more central fat than leg fat than I do in my last off-season. Well, your testosterone and estrogen are in a very different place. That will come back once you're fully recovered. But like post-recovery body weight comparisons on similar-ish diets are really helpful. So in my 2024 off-season compared to 2023, I looked at where am I at 80, 88 kilos compared to last time I was at 88, and I was like, man, I look way bigger. And then if you have access to it, many don't. There are some body comp tests that I think are worthwhile. I think finding a ISAC certified anthropometrist and having the same person in the right conditions look at an 8-site summary of your skin folds, not putting them into an estimation equation for body fat percentage, and also doing girths and circumferences in the same conditions, that can be really powerful because it's, we all want to know a body fat percentage, but it's useless outside of talking about it online, right? For a competitor like me, I know what my 8-site sum is when I'm close to stage weight. I get under 30 millimeters across the 8 ISAC sites, and that's when I'm like, okay, we're in stage ready condition. So in the off season, in 2024, I saw that at 88 kilos, not only did I look better, but my measurements were higher, and my sum of 8 was lower than the last time I was at 88. So that's that kind of objective confidence that it gives me. But you can only see visual progress or even measure quantitative objective progress over time scales that it will occur. So I think it's just really important to understand what are realistic expectations for you. And I think I'm case in point that you can set those, but still be wrong, because you simply don't gain 4 to 5 pounds of muscle in 15 months if you are a truly elite level top tier competitor who is actually close. And actually, that's false. No, if you're truly near the peak of your personal muscular potential. So the good news is I'm further away from my muscular potential than I thought. The bad news is I didn't know that until I had taken a whole reassessment and stepped away from strength sport to fully commit to bodybuilding. But then I was pleasantly surprised. But I think many people would have assumed, well, Helms is pretty much done. He's 40. He's trained for almost 20 years, or like 18 years at the time I made this shift. His total has kind of started to plateau a little bit. And he's looked a little bit better season to season. His stage weight was the same 2019 and 2023. What's he going to do? I'm sure he's doing everything. And the reality is that I was doing everything I could within the context of being a dual athlete who was committed fully to being a dual athlete and sometimes a multi-sport strength athlete along with being a physique competitor.
Yeah, I think there, like that final one there is like a extremely important point because like I've been in the same boat like the last year. Like I've did my last powerlifting competition last April and I've been pretty much all in on bodybuilding since. And I was even just looking at some pictures today from the same body weight this time last year, and like just with like a year of just bodybuilding and dedicating everything towards that, the change is completely different. Like just like that increase of specificity, that shift of volume away from the demanding sets of 3 on squats to do more lateral raises. Now I'm focusing on actually training my back with a lot more intent than just training my bench press, for example. It like the difference is night and day. And of course, if you do that for a long enough period of time, like it's almost like I got like newbie gains to a degree.
Mm-hmm.
And you said, this is a podcast that you did earlier on this week, and you were mentioning about like even at this stage of the game, you do have to come into the training process with like the open mind that it's still possible, because otherwise you wouldn't be putting all your chips on the table, as you said, to try to get those marginal gains. Because when it comes to bodybuilding at like the level you're at, that's what it comes down to, especially when you're competing against the people who they're well endowed with their genetics, so you don't really have any opportunity to slack. Like you also mentioned with you brought up age, okay, and I think this is something that a lot of people, especially a lot of guys, right, they hear testosterone is going to start to decrease as I get to 30. What's the point? And it's like there's many points. there's many points. Yeah. Regardless of like if you didn't gain muscle, it's a good avenue to not go down a bad path. Did something beneficial to pass the time, good for mental health, increase bone mineral density, aid your quality of life, yada yada yada. And if you jack in the process, I mean, it's not a bad option.
Yeah. And there's just so much misinformation out there, and so much is context dependent and the framing. So, like, it is true that testosterone declines if I just got out, if I just ran around and started getting testosterone samples from everyone in the world, you would start to see slightly lower testosterones in people in their 40s compared to 20s, and definitely people compared to like adolescents, even compared to their late 20s. But then as soon as you start doing things like controlling for obesity, controlling for smoking, controlling for physical activity, and you control for all the things that typically fall off, as much as we all think about how much we experimented and did silly things in high school, and I speak not from personal experience because I'm lame, but from knowing other people. If you were an athlete in high school compared to afterwards, and then what it was like when you got parents, your sleep quality, all of the things that co-vary with being in your 40s, 50s, and later, they have a substantial impact on the things that we see as quote unquote aging. And when we look at healthy aging models and people who are doing all the things that they know they should, and doing many of the things that they were doing in their youth, it's a very different picture. Like the concept of anabolic resistance. This is a true phenomenon where if we measure muscle protein synthesis responses to protein in elderly people, again, people who ask me like, I'm 38, do I need to eat more protein? I'm like, get the hell out of here. But in studies on people who are over 65 and over 70, we do see reduced muscle protein synthesis in response acutely to protein feeding, right? However, When you look at Scandinavian populations where there is a population-wide higher degree of activity because of the built environment they have, we're talking about living in Copenhagen as a 70-year-old, that difference actually becomes non-significant compared to younger people when you compare it to populations in the West that are a lot more isolated and don't live in a good built environment conducive to physical activity. And when you look at data on masters athletes, people in their 40s, 50s, like 60 and lower, but still actively competing as athletes, the difference is not measurable. And there are no data to indicate that individuals in, say, the M1 category, if we're talking powerlifting, are actually at a disadvantage for gaining like strength or muscle mass. We don't have the data to support that, or even their ability to recover from training. And in fact, when we control for all these factors and we just look at testosterone doesn't reliably decrease in healthy, active populations when you control for obesity, smoking, etc., sedentary lifestyle, until you're into the 5th or 6th decade of life. So, and if this was something that completely controverted your expectations, if you're listening to this, you're like, oh no, but all of my, everyone I know, I feel different, etc. I think you need to look at a population where maybe those things have been controlled for and are being controlled for a little better. So for example, if you look at drug-free bodybuilding, who is on the pro stage in the bodybuilding category and doing well, the average age goes up from the amateurs. And in fact, it is completely normal and totally common for people in their 40s and even 50s to do well at the pro level. So I was, placing 6th at 42 in the middleweight division, or sorry, the light heavyweight division this last time. But I wasn't at all alone. The winner of the over 50 pro division, Joe Faresi, he is 56, and he placed, I think, 9th or 10th, right? There was another competitor who was in his mid 40s, who I competed with at the Mayhem, and he placed lower, but it was also his pro debut. But the point is that he's a professional natural bodybuilder getting better into his late 40s, and Joe Faresi is still arguably at his peak. He's not, like, he might not be quite as good as he was in his mid to late 40s if you look at him now, but he is absolutely a competitive, pro bodybuilder. Jeff Alberts at 52 placed top 5 in the biggest class in 2023. And I can give a lot of examples of this. Many, many, many. Martin Daniels, of course, Marshall Johnson, right? There are, Leroy Perry from back in the day. Honestly, I could sit here and list names that people have forgotten or may not know for a very long time. I could take up maybe a couple minutes because I'm kind of a natural bodybuilding historian. But I would say that it is the norm for natural bodybuilders to be peaking so long as they stay injury-free, which I think has more to do with just time in the gym rather than time in their body, to be competitive in 30s, 40s, and even into early 50s if they do an intelligent, smart job and stay motivated. They may not be getting better in their 50s, unless they were doing a lot of things wrong first and they finally got a coach or something like that. But it is not uncommon to see people improve and peak in their early 40s, mid 40s, and even late 40s. I think that's actually a pretty common thing. There's too many anecdotes to look at it and go, hey, this is just a freak chance occurrence. And the data supports that. We don't have data on like fat-free mass index changes in natural bodybuilders, but we do have data on IPF powerlifters. And it is not actually until you hit M3 and M4. So this is not over 40, that's M1, not over 50, that's M2, but over 60 and over 70 that you start to see a lack of progress in women and a decline in men in that M4. So that means M1 and M2, over 40, over 50, they may have just started lifting, but it also includes lifters who've been lifting for 20 or 30 years. They are still improving. They're still getting stronger. I would love to see a conditional analysis of, and they must have been lifting for the last 10 years. I think that would change things a bit. But there are tons of examples of people who are getting better in the M1 category, at the very least, on the men and women's side in powerlifting. Lane Norton is an example. Back in the day, when powerlifting is a little less competitive, he got a silver in the 93 kilo class, and he's actually hitting equal or slightly better PB totals now. And he's a year older than me, so he's 43. And there are other examples, many notable. Sam Watt out in the UK, and Mike T, 100%. Yep. Ellis McLean, when he won his 2 world titles, he was in his 40s. There's many, many examples. So, and I think powerlifting is more likely to constrain you from age due to the higher injury rate and the fact that if you look at actual sarcopenia data and the mechanisms, there's less clear data on loss of total muscle mass and a little more clear data on specific loss of high threshold motor units in type 2 fibers. So if you look at age, power production is constrained first, then absolute strength, and only then muscle mass. So you can retain peak levels of muscularity a lot longer. And that also fits with what we know about the hypertrophy research, that it's a very forgiving adaptation. You know, you can shift, if you got knee pain, you can start doing super slow training, not super slow, but like 3-second concentric, 3-second eccentric. The most current data on, you know, how do you deal with, say, knee tendonitis or tendonitis in general is heavy, slow resistance training. So you go as heavy as you can within the confines of doing a 3-second concentric and a 3-second eccentric. And so long as, for the purpose of hypertrophy, that 3-second concentric goes from a voluntary slowing to involuntary, and actually took you 3 seconds of the concentric because you're close to failure, it's just as stimulative as a set where you're doing max effort on every single concentric rep. You know, and we've even got Dorian Verovic's data, the first study comparing long muscle length isometrics compared to time-matched total training of normal reps, and at least in this one study, similar quadriceps hypertrophy. Machines versus free weights, similar hypertrophy. High reps versus low reps, similar hypertrophy. Blood flow restriction versus heavy training, similar hypertrophy. So like there's a will, there's a way, so long as you know the tools and the methods that are at your disposal. And I think I personally have not seen an issue with my athletes in their 40s. And I actually am in the best shape of my life, and I feel the best I ever have. I haven't slowed down at all. Now I'm 42, not 52. So I'm anticipating that will change in the next 10 years. But I do think I have a good 10 years, at least, at the worst case scenario, being at this as my peak. And you know what? If I died or got forcibly retired from natural bodybuilding, and you said, you know what, your best ever was 6th place in a competitive light heavyweight pro division at Worlds, you know, dead middle of the pack, I'd be like, you know what? That's further than I ever thought I got. Didn't even know I'd get my WBF pro card, so I'm happy. You know, so for me, even if it takes me till I'm 48 to kind of really kind of hit that asymptote where I'm not making any more progress and I put on another kilo of muscle mass by then and I craft the top 5 or the top 3, like, it's all extra credit, man. We're talking icing on the cake already.
What do you think are some, like, because I know you know a lot of the natural bodybuilders who are in their like 40s to 50s. What would you say are like some like common characteristics and like traits that the people who get to that stage have? Because I think a lot of people, they let other things get in the way when it does come to their lifting, and bodybuilding goes to the side. Whether it could be career, family, understandably. But you know, I think it's something really impressive to see people still having a love and a passion for competing at those ages and continuing to get better. So from those, you know, like, what are the general characteristics that you see?
I think there's actually 2 really, really, really major things. Is one, they still love competing, they still love bodybuilding, and they are still infatuated and excited about the idea of making progress. Now, the thing is that looks a little different when you're 20, and it looks a little different when you're 40. You start actively thinking about death more and more and more the older you get. And this, I think, is a really important thing because we all die. I know tech billionaires are not ready to accept that, and maybe that will change if you're a tech billionaire in the future, or at least you'll be able to upload your consciousness onto some kind of, you know, computer, or put your brain in a box. Watch Fallout, great show. But right now, everybody dies, and before you die, you come to terms with a lot of other things that you lose. Everything gets taken from you, and finally your life. And for lifters, a really tough one is your last PR, especially if you're a power lifter or a strength athlete. And for physique athletes, you start to come down the other side of that peak, and you start to see yourself on stage worse than you were, and there's nothing you can do about it. Most of the time in your early career, you know why you weren't as good, or you can figure out a reason, you try to correct it, and then you get better again. I regressed in my 2011 season from 09 and 07. That happens. You take a certain approach, you try something out, you get hurt, you come back from burnout, life circumstances, a divorce, struggling with a relapse and alcoholism. I've heard them all these stories, right? But for the people who keep progressing past the point when many others would perhaps have given up or thought it's not worth it, it just stays worth it. And, like when you say, like, I let other things get in the way, sometimes it is the rational, correct, moral, value-based approach to choose other things over that. You have a new job, a new family, and you feel satisfied with what you've done, and you're no longer interested in the actual competitive outcome. And that was the piece that actually wanted you to try to even get better. But you're pretty happy with your body, you're happy with your health, and you become more health conscious because you're focusing on your longevity. And maybe your main reason for training wasn't just to aggressively and obsessively pursue progress. I think many of the folks who keep progressing, they find a way to integrate it with their lives. They don't sacrifice it, because that's another thing, is that if you have to make sacrifices to your values or to your relationships to make progress now, that eventually becomes unsustainable. Those people burn out earlier. So I think when I say this message of, oh, these are the people who don't let things get in the way, which is not what I said, but it's the way it's interpreted sometimes. Or these are the people who keep the goal. I think it hooks into their grind attitude and their, sacrifice to win attitude. And they forget that actually that's not what it looks like when you see a 50-year-old who's better on stage when they were 47. That person found a way to tick all of the most important boxes while still adhering to their values, still maintaining their relationship, still living their life. They're not taking weeks off of work. They're not becoming assholes. They're not, taking their food scale with them. They have found strategies that enable them to live their life, and they live the lifestyle of bodybuilding. And of course, it's still hard and all those things, but they've so integrated into their lifestyle that it is something that they can do with less effort over time and less sacrifices, because it's just who they are. So I think that's one, is that they have created an environment where it is still important to them and they can still do it. And two, I think it is really being able to stay injury-free. So I think that's the huge component. Most of the time it is musculoskeletal limitations. So people who have an intelligent, creative, aggressive, but still conservative approach to training, so that they can avoid any kind of career-ending injuries. And there's a lot of other sub things that come with that. You need to have a healthy relationship with food, your body, the social environment. You need to not be totally wrapped up in competing, or that makes you burn out, because it's a super subjective sport. And if you're pushing to get better, you need to want to do that inherently and potentially competitively, because some people realize, I don't need the stage or judges to validate my progress. I'll just do photo shoots, or I'll assess it in some other way. It's like, why are you getting on stage? So for us to even observe it, they need to have extrinsic motivators that still get them out of bed and into the gym and busting their ass, and intrinsic motivators. And then finally, they need to have the belief, because you can talk yourself into thinking that you are past your prime or can't make progress a lot. But in reality, it's almost never a quantitative or a physiological thing that prevents people from getting their peak. It's just no longer worth it. Their values don't align with it, and the work that they have to put in just doesn't seem worth the marginal gains that they can make. But for someone like me, I can tell you my personal motivation is, I love the idea of it's almost impossible to build your last maybe 3 kilos of muscle. Let's say that's what I've got left. There's a world where I get on stage at 85, 86 kilos, and oh my God, me 190 pounds on stage, I'd look like a freak. And I go, that is potentially possible. And actually, I'm more believing that it's possible based upon the progress I made in this year and a half. But I also know that that's going to be the slowest gains I've ever made. It's only going to get harder. It's like walking up an ever increasingly steep hill. And to get there, I need to take advantage of every single lever I can pull, which gets me intellectually stimulated. And it's a puzzle to solve. So it gets my neuro, diverse brain working on this and going, oh man, it gets me hyper-focused. That is not demotivating to me. So I think if someone has the personality knowing that they have to work harder to get less, and that's demotivating, they need to shift that, or it's going to be an uphill battle and experience. But for me, I'm actually more motivated to make less gains with more effort, mentally and physically. As crazy as that sounds, because it's a problem to solve. It's not coming easy. And I have to be like, all right, well, how do I make room to do more volume to increase the rate? And then how do I add the volume in such a way and at a pace that I don't spike my acute chronic workload, make my tendonitis pop up, and then I'm out and unable to train optimally for months. So it's this balancing act that I just love. I get the same thing out of coaching, and it's funny. We were talking about perception and the demands of powerlifting. One of the first things I did was, well, let me shift strength sport out of this equation. I have way more adaptive capacity. And I think some people with a powerlifting bias, or who think that strength and hypertrophy are really close, are like, that shouldn't be a major thing. Like, they're really, really similar, getting stronger and getting bigger. And it's like, they are, but when you're trying to eke out marginal gains and you're trying to solve an optimization logistical problem, they can become the bottleneck. They're not for 99% of people, because you're never going to get close to your peak. No offense. Most people remain intermediates. And from a health and longevity and enjoyment perspective, that's totally fine. But think about it this way, like rugby league, New Zealand Warriors. This is the Auckland team that play a certain type of rugby. These guys are jacked, genetic freaks, train incredibly hard. And if you went into the Warriors training camp on a day when they were doing hypertrophy training, and you saw how big they were, and you saw that some of them were in their late 20s and 30s, and they've been training in part of these rugby academies since they were preteens, you'd be like, these guys are at their peak muscular potential. And I see them train. They train hard, and they're training effectively. They have, S&Cs with master's degrees. Like, these guys have sometimes 3 times body weight squats, and it's not even their sport, that they're done. But then you think about it, like, honestly, all the things that we've asked of these guys in the contact sport, where they're also doing conditioning training, sports-specific training, traveling, and getting concussions and being unable to sleep and recover. And most of them don't know crap about nutrition. Like, you'd be surprised what they do, right? If you honestly told me that they hired a bodybuilding coach, quit rugby, and just dedicated all of their time and energy to becoming the most impressive bodybuilder they could, that they'd be the same size, you'd be like, oh, I get it. Now, obviously, powerlifting is a lot closer, but I think that's like the furthest thing you can look at, where you still might think in just a microcosm, a vacuum, like, oh, there's no way these guys could be bigger. They're all at their genetic peak. These guys are, maxed out freaks. And you'd be like, oh, some of these guys are way too big. They've got to be on gear. Honestly, they're probably not. They're just that genetically talented. You go like, oh, hold on. What if they went all in on bodybuilding? Do we actually think that with the same genetics that you can get to the top tier of this other sport here with just doing hypertrophy training in a surplus twice per week for 6 months out of the year? And the rest of the time you're like barely trying to stay in the status of energy availability because you're on the road and clocking like basically multiple 800-meter sprints in a multi-hour game and smashing into each other, and actually creating tissue death, in your quadricep or your pec or wherever you got hit, and having to do ACL reconstructions and shit like that. You go, oh, wow. These guys are probably at like 80% of their max muscularity. If we really wanted to come down to it, and we rewinded the clock in at 17, in this magical country that doesn't exist called bodybuilding land, they got enrolled in a bodybuilding academy, not a rugby academy. And they walked it all the way up in the most efficient way possible with the sports science and sports nutrition team around them. And High Performance Sport New Zealand had a bodybuilding team of physiologists who did everything they could to get you to max muscularity by the time you're 30. These guys would be monsters, right? And even though they're already.
Yeah. Sure, you just have to look at any of the people who do powerlifting who used to play like college football. Like, they're typically all absolute monsters. Like Ray Williams comes to mind.
100%.
Taylor Atwood, I'm pretty sure he played it at a pretty decent level as well, didn't he? Russ Orhey as well, I think, was another one. So yeah, plenty of examples. Unfortunately, there's not as much money in powerlifting or natural bodybuilding as there is in those sports stuff. So I don't think we're going to see any crossover from them too soon. So
but 100%.
So I guess like one thing that's obviously going to be different between a lot of those more advanced bodybuilders is they all have different training styles, and I guess like you have your training style, right? Like I watched all your stories, and you do a lot of high volume, you do a lot of supersets. a lot of exercise per session. But then to the opposite end of the spectrum, just within your own coaching company, right? You have Jeff, and Jeff does a lot lower volume than you do, a lot more simplistic. And I guess this is going to follow on to the discussion with the pyramids and training and how so many different things work, right? Because you can clearly see you've made some phenomenal progress across like your last off season by pushing to that level of performance and pushing that approach. Jeff at the same time doing the exact same. And there's always this debate online: high volume, low volume. It's even gotten worse now. Fucking debates around specific rep ranges. Just people kind of essentially majoring in the minors, right? I like the fact that the pyramids, when I first stumbled upon it, it just gave me a nice framework to look at training because I had never thought about it like that before. I didn't really understand the order of importance. And I think this is right now what is confusing so many people on social media because they're seeing reel after reel of just this like small bits of information, and they don't know how to partition all that information into something that's actually going to inform them when it does come to making training decisions. So when you were actually coming up with the pyramids initially, obviously you had to do a lot of reading. We also had a lot of experience behind your back too. How did you determine how you're going to go about with the levels, and then structuring them?
Yeah, it was a tough one for the training side of it. And that's why it took a couple years more before I made the videos for the training pyramid. For those who don't know, the pyramids didn't start even as their first edition book. They started as a YouTube series on the Team 3D Muscle Journey YouTube channel. And the nutrition pyramid came out, and yeah, man. And it was recorded on the S3 when I was still a master's student at AUT in our small conference room at Sprins. And man, it's crazy. It's 14 years later almost. And now I'm the co-director of Sprins. Did my master's, did my PhD, became a research fellow, became the strength conditioning lab leader, and now I'm running the institute. I should say leading the institute and trying to represent its members as best I can, giving back, looking at, wow, I was just a kid back then, even though I was in my late 20s. But the training pyramid took me a couple more years before I released that in video format, that then led to us going, these should be books, due to Andrea's urging and the example of Andy Morgan writing some really good articles about it. I'm like, from video to written format. But what they came from first was identified the problem. And just imagine, I identified this problem as a major problem I wanted to solve in 2012 and how bad it is now. That people were information rich. If they were already seeking me out and they wanted to sit down on a consultation, because at this stage I wasn't the science communicator primarily that you know me as now. I wasn't the chief science officer of 3DMJ. I mean, I was, but I was the most, I was doing my second master's. I had been studying obsessively about this since I started lifting, because it's just who I am. I was doing my academic career, but I was still a full-time coach for my master's. I had a full-time roster of athletes who were reporting in weekly of 40-ish. And then I was doing 5-ish 1-hour consultations with fresh faces or repeated faces, talking about like, hey, what are you doing? What are your goals? And how can we set that up? And one morning, my wife said, I bet you I could give one of your consultations to a first-time athlete. And I was like, you probably can. You've heard me do so many, and they all have and 80 to 90% of them have the same problem. They know everything that I'm going to tell them, but they have no ability to tell what are the big rocks, what are the pebbles, and what's the sand. What should they put their energy into? And they're trying to master too many skills all at the same time. And the changing marketing environment in 2012, this kind of proto-social media era, and the time when the evidence-based community was finally starting to figure out how to do marketing, while still giving good information, it's even when they found me and they were following the other evidence-based voices at that time, they were confused and overwhelmed. Because whether it was the correct information on meal timing, the correct information on supplements, the correct information on refeeds or diet breaks that existed at that time, the correct information on macronutrient distribution, or the correct information on caloric intake, rates of weight loss, it was always packaged the same way. This is the thing you're missing. This is the key to your success. Everything you know is wrong, and you need to get this or you're not going to make gains. So people are operating from a non-critical thinking part of their brain, purely because they've been triggered by what's online, fear-based content, you're missing this, being pulled in every direction. And they get exposed to all this information, but they're hearing multiple different voices, and the content was coming faster and faster, and the marketing suggested everything was the most important thing. And when everything requires your attention, nothing gets your attention. So I wasn't telling them anything they didn't know, but I was creating a system and a frame of mind and a filter and a hierarchy for them to follow. So I just turned that into a system that I could apply en masse. And that was the pyramids. Like, hey, stop worrying about the timing of your creatine and caffeine because you're worried about one interfering with the other related to your workout and also impacting sleep, because you don't actually know your maintenance calories, right? Or, you know, you are separating your carbohydrates and fat because of some theoretical understanding of insulin you don't really fully believe, but that person was really convincing of you listen to. So just in case, I now have, you know, my carb meals separated from my fat meals, even though I'm hitting macros, right? Those types of things I identified. And the same thing with training. People were program hopping, and they understood these various different mechanisms of hypertrophy, or at least as we understood them at that time. They had different ideas about what strength might apply. So they had all these concepts, but they didn't know how to actually put it into action, and everything was the most important thing. Now, nutrition was easy, honestly. Like, energy balance is the first step, and because everybody eats, and because it's not about something that we choose to do, like, you don't have to train, right? You know, like, if you want to go out there and train for strength or hypertrophy, that is a choice, but everybody's got to eat. And the physiology of eating is a lot more straightforward, you know, metabolism and energy in healthy people than the actual physiology of adaptations past the point of those kind of early newbie gains where it's like, oh, you just go in the right direction and you're going to get, you know, 10 pounds of muscle and a 25% increase in strength, almost regardless, as long as it's somewhere in the realm of sensible, right? So people who want to make intermediate gains or more in resistance training, either in strength or hypertrophy, it's a little more complex than that. And yet that information-rich, context-poor environment that existed in 2012 is, not to use an overused pun that really does mean something to our audience, it's on steroids now. It's on like Olympia Open Division level of polypharmacy steroids. And it is faster, it's quicker, it's more controversial, and people are literally now making disinformation on purpose rather than just having the wrong information or the wrong context like they did 14 years ago. Rage bait is a thing, you know? Saying something controversial just so you get more eyeballs on it is a thing, you know? And unfortunately and fortunately, being evidence-based is a super popular marketing strategy right now. There was no such thing as a Jeremy Etier, Jeff Nippard, RP, or even Huberman, to be honest, these science-forward communicators who were the biggest on their platform. You know, like Jeff and Jeremy, we're talking 5 to 8 million subscribers, right? RP channel blew up using a very, very science-focused thing. Era I was coming up, we were in a fight with the bros, and now we have people who, you know, are doing so much science-based lifting and using that as a marketing tool and misunderstanding it and kind of misappropriating it, that it's creating a certain segment who are pulling away from it. But in the population at large, while we see this kind of anti-science movement, science couldn't be healthier. You know, we have like Techno Gym and Optimum Nutrition hiring me and bringing me out to places to speak because they want to be aligned with science. They want to be associated with it because they see that in the current popular culture, a Huberman Lab podcast can blow up, where as much as sometimes he says things that are inaccurate or uses controversy, like it is still science forward, and he gets just barely more things right than wrong on average, or at least at a high enough level, you know, like, so I think knowing that we're in that market, it makes things more confusing, unfortunately, because now people actually are not treating relevant science like, oh my God, I found gold, like they did 15 years ago, and like I did, but oh my God, another science thing, a flip-flop, because they don't have science literacy. They don't understand how it fits in the rest of the context of all the other research. They haven't, like you intimated, read literally every study that exists on hypertrophy and body composition change and is trying to actively find it, because that's what I do obsessively. And that's why it was easy for me to do 2 master's degrees and a PhD. Not easy, but it was a natural fit. And why I started Mass Research Review in 2017. I've got 9 years, 1,000+ pieces of content, and every month I basically write like a bachelor's dissertation on 2 studies. It's what I do. It's what I love, and I'm constantly looking for more opportunities to educate people. So the coaching experience, my personal experience, simply having my ear to the ground and watching what it's like as a content creator to try to cut through that noise, or even when it's not noise, when the information is accurate, how do I make sense of it, was the motivation for the pyramids. Now, the reason why the training book was hard and the training pyramid hierarchy was hard to develop, and it actually took me 2 years of just thinking through it, is because you have to accept certain framings and perspectives for that hierarchy to hold true. And you could very easily say, no, this is not true. So a great example is that exercise selection is in kind of the middle of the pyramid, right? Now, if you had a really, really poor set of exercise selection, it would subvert everything else. If you really chose exercises that had poor resistance profiles, only kind of minimally trained the muscle groups you were training for from a hypertrophy perspective, the dosing would be way off. You would need to do a massive amount of volume to the point it would be counterproductive. You would need to train really close to failure, but these are exercises where maybe they're not even that well suited to training the target muscle groups, and it would subvert earlier parts of the pyramid. So the framing I put, like if you read the exercise selection, is okay, for strength, we're assuming that you are doing a reasonable amount of squat, bench, and deadlift, and that this is aimed at powerlifters, because that's where most people start. You're copying what others do, and success leaves some clues. You don't find powerlifters who actually promote, we actually don't ever train the main lifts. Like, that's not a thing. And even the most quote unquote non-specific powerlifting training to a non-powerlifter, they might look at it and go, there's no different to that than what Agata Sitko does with SBD every day. They're very, very similar. Like, I don't know, but they're doing a pause, or yeah, but that's a 3 count, or there's a board there, or something like that. Especially in the raw powerlifting era, the amount of non-specific accessory work has decreased. And, a non-specific is like, oh, we don't do top singles, but I do triples. And it's like, oh my God, So in reality, you can see that the kind of baseline default is very important. And for bodybuilding, I assume that someone is training in a traditional way of exercise selection. Like someone is going to come in and do a row and a pull down and a squat pattern and a hinge. And if we start there, then it makes sense for it to be, somewhere in the middle of the pyramid. But if we start with just a raw first principles approach, you could easily argue that exercise selection is just as important as volume intensity. And another one is you have to also make sure that people don't misunderstand what you're saying. So one that constantly comes up in the academic community is that I have the very base is adherence, which everyone is fine with because you don't go to the gym, you don't make any gains regardless of what you do. And the next one is the dose, which I've changed from the second and first edition from volume, intensity, and frequency to volume and intensity, because those are the primary drivers of adaptation. And then frequency is a distribution tool, and it's more important for lifting, for strength, than it is for size. But then I have progression. And for people who know the principle of progressive overload, they go, how can you have progressive overload before you have anything else, right? That is the key principle of adaptation. And this is because progressive overload is often misunderstood. And progression is not the same thing as progressive overload. In fact, part of me wishes that we could never have the term progressive, which sounds crazy. It sounds like blasphemy from an exercise science perspective. But if you understand how physiology works, all you need is overload, right? Because each time you train, after overloading previously, overload means that you did a sufficient amount to make an adaptation. And when you make an adaptation, you've now reset the bar, however small it might have been, for what will constitute overload next time, right? And not next time like next training session, but over a training experience appropriate time frame. This is why harder than last time is far too unnuanced unless you're just starting lifting, right? So progressive overload should be built in. And because it is something that people think they have to do and implement, they think they need to add weight to the bar or reps every single time. But in reality, if we think about this, if we really think about this, like let's take someone totally new to the gym. And I know a lot of bodybuilders and powerlifters are also personal trainers. the most they've ever squatted is their body weight, getting in and up out of chairs, right? And the number of reps is typically 1 or 2. Like, oh, I dropped my keys, there's 2, right? But the average person who goes to the gym, who is, in normal physical health, you could put a bar on their back. That's 20 kilos. And you could have them squat that probably 10 times and be far from failure. Yet that would actually make them stronger because it is a significant increase in what they've ever done. And then you ask the question, well, how long can they just do 1 set of 10 per week with 20 kilos, 2 depth back squats, and grow their legs and get stronger without changing anything? So no progression. How long would that be an overload stimulus? Actually, for a few months. And their 1RM would be going up even if you didn't test it. You wouldn't know it. But eventually, what was overload becomes the warm-up for a set that never came, right? And at that point, now they actually need to do more reps, more volume, or increase the load because they're so far from failure that they're not tapping into what are now higher threshold motor units, right? So I think that's something that people forget. They just look at what did I do on paper last time, which is a perfectly fine heuristic, but it becomes challenging once you're kind of in that intermediate stage. So progression is about systems to facilitate progress, not overload. And so long as you get the dose right, the volume and the intensity, overload is occurring. And then it's just a matter of how do I balance the fatigue and the stimulus, and how do I make sure we optimize this process, and how, once I start making really slow incremental gains, do I know whether I'm actually progressing? What systems should I use to encourage it? How do I diagnose if I'm not progressing because I'm pushing too hard too fast, or my recovery environment's not ideal, or I'm simply not doing enough, or I'm doing enough but in an unideal way, which is covered maybe in the progression chapter or in other chapters, right? Like, I'm doing a lot of training volume, I'm doing it at high intensity, but my rest periods, my tempo, or my exercise selection are making that dose far more efficient than it actually could be. Or I need to look at the other book entirely because I'm not eating enough protein, I'm not sleeping, I'm not creating, a sufficient amount of energy. I'm trying to recomp for years and years and years, and I'm already 6% body fat, etc. So framing up the hierarchy for the training pyramid was actually a pretty tough task. And if you read the introduction to the nutrition book, it really follows logically. Like, yeah, first we start with energy balance, then where's that energy come from? Okay, then what are the foods that consist of where those macronutrients and energy come from, and how do we make sure we get enough of the micronutrients? Oh, and then when do we eat? But, there's not a huge difference because, digestion slows down if you're eating 2 meals, 3 meals, or 5 or 6. And then finally, are there anything you can do to supplement your diet, right? Very easy to explain. I just did it in less than a minute. But for training, you can see in the introduction each chapter, I have to be like, all right, assuming you have these things set up in place, and let me explain to you what progressive overload means and how it's misunderstood, and now you can understand why progression comes after the dose, which provides the overload. And now we're going to talk about exercise selection, and now we're going to talk about tempo. And in the final 2 chapters of tempo and rest periods, a large part of the message is you really could do this in a way that would screw up the dose and make the exercise selection and the volume and intensity and the frequency not matter and your progression scheme not matter if you're trying to do, not even EMOMs, but like every 10 seconds on the second with your sets. Like this is subverting everything else. I don't care how many sets you're trying to do. Like you're lifting your pinky at the end of it, right? So how do we not mess up things that are higher in the hierarchy when we've established these initial constraints? So it took me a couple of years, and they have subtly shifted over time as the evidence has come out. We've better understood these relationships. And they also have to agree with the anecdotal experience. And I think I have clung and stayed with the term evidence-based very intentionally. While the industry has kind of vilified science-based, I'm fine with that because evidence includes all forms of evidence and a full understanding of it. And then also in combination with experience, personal preferences, individual differences, and the changing environment that you're going to be dealing with. So evidence-based practice is something that I've also taught more and more and more within the books. I've embedded more things of how to think and how to learn in the books over time as the environment we're in the social media age has subverted our critical thinking more and more and more. So my books are ideally the antidote to much of the problems that you brought up.
I guess like with the way of thinking, right, that you mentioned there, I'm interested to know when it does come to like appraising new information and appraising new evidence that comes in. How do you put that in line with everything that maybe you've already written in previous editions? Because like obviously, one study in isolation, it doesn't really tell us much. And I think this is one of the big issues with the science communication that you see from 16-year-olds on, on Instagram, is that they're trying to use like a single study to support a point. And obviously, if you look any deeper than that, there could be another study to completely counter what they have brought up. So how do you go about appraising new information and I guess kind of meeting a consensus kind of decision as to how important that variable or that decision is?
This is where you have to understand the process of science to some degree, and understanding another pyramid, the evidence hierarchy. People typically understand evidence-based practice as this three-legged stool. There is individual differences and preferences depending upon how you frame it, or both. There is the scientific evidence, and then there's your experience as a practitioner. And these are equal three things that all contribute, and you're an evidence-based practitioner. The reality, though, is that those three stools are not equal contributors. They're contextually different at different times. And some of them become almost not important anymore after a certain stage, or they become the only thing you can use. And it probably doesn't make sense to think of experience as anecdotal evidence and science as scientific evidence in that three-legged stool. And if you look at more modern, nuanced conceptions of evidence-based practice, it describes it differently. And you'll notice in my books, I don't have that three-legged stool with that Venn diagram. I have one that shows the lifter or the coach at the center of biopsychosocial, environmental, and then evidence is kind of a collaborative thing. And the reason why I put evidence on one part of that Venn diagram and why it's shown this way in some models is because it's very difficult to objectively draw a line in the sand between anecdotal evidence and observational research. One is just formal and it made it into a peer-reviewed study, right? But let's say you have a strength and conditioning coach. We'll go back to that like Warriors example. Got a master's degree, maybe even got his PhD, trained sports scientist. And he has an Excel spreadsheet and he's using force plates. He's got the power of big money sports science behind him, which is crazy in certain sports because they're huge. Maybe he's even using ultrasound or MRI or DEXA regularly. He's got lab-based or better equipment to test his athletes. There is no control group. There's no placebo. There's no alternate environment. But he's regularly measuring them, and he has measures that are just as valid as they are in research of internal and external monitoring and looking at changes over time. So this quote-unquote combined intervention has a known effect. And he can also liaise with the nutritionist, the athletes themselves, even qualitative data. He knows their recovery environment, right? And he has prior season data on these athletes. He may even know what their coefficient of variation is, which means nothing, but that's an objective way of saying, okay, how much change relative to your normal variability that we just see day to day for whatever environment you're in, should we anticipate is a quote-unquote real change? And then he's making changes based upon when and whether or not there are real changes or regressions that can be attributed to something outside of typical variation. And then he puts it all into a spreadsheet and runs appropriate N of 1 statistics to assess whether there's a real change in that individual. And then also on the group level data for all of his athletes, and actually puts it into R and puts out a report, right? If he technically had simply gone to a university and got ethics approval to do that, and it wasn't proprietary data that was embargoed by his team, most certainly, that would be publishable observational data. That would be a case series, right? And all of a sudden now it's in a different part of the pyramid or a different Venn diagram. No, it's not. That is the highest quality possible anecdotal data, and it is equivalent to observational data and research. And arguably, it would be higher than, say, like a narrative review and invited opinion piece in the hierarchy of evidence. So the hierarchy of evidence is all evidence, whether it is in a lab or not. And there's a huge disparity between anecdotal stuff, like 17-year-old bro who says, hey, I made great gains on this program, finally started sleeping and stopped playing Fortnite before bed, and nothing to do with the program, right? Okay, like that could be the reason why. He's actually focused on something. That is often bucketed by the more science-forward thinkers Just the same as if that coach who I was just talking about got on Twitter, couldn't share his data because it's proprietary, and said, I have a lot of confidence in this approach for S&C for warriors. And then some scientist is like, yeah, N of 5, who cares, and denigrates. And it's like, but if this was published, you wouldn't say that. So that framing, I think, is not helpful. And we see it perpetuated in the anti-science kind of back and forth. So understanding the limitations of science and the limitations of anecdotes, and then what you have to do to actually make a decision, is a huge part of the second chapter in both books. Once we go through adherence and the basic lifestyle stuff, then we go, okay, I'm going to start giving you the highest quality evidence with context, but I need to teach you what a meta-analysis is. I need to teach you what a systematic review is. I need you to know why I'm only citing one study on volume, intensity, and frequency, or 2 or 3. It's because they're not just studies. They're studies of studies. These are meta-regressions with complex modeling that have been looking at every study ever done on volume that's measured a direct change in muscle mass in a specific muscle, not DEXA, since the 80s. And it's 35 studies, and it's actually 1,000 participants that we're looking at. It's our most precise way, and it actually models this in a nonlinear way and gives us different answers. Then you need to know why in the next chapter, what I'm talking about, what is the minimum number of reps per set you should do for hypertrophy to make sure that a given set, quote unquote, counts on equal footing to another given set. Well, I'm only citing 4 studies because they don't have a meta-analysis, and I still got to tell you what to do. So the best available evidence is all of the studies on this topic. And then we look at what the differences are, and we make a less confident, but still evidence-based, informed recommendation. And I think understanding that you always should be relying on the best available evidence, not just what you know about, just what fits your bias. And you also include it in that evidence-based framework where you kind of fact check it against the reality. Okay, here's what we see in the real world. Why does or does that not comport with what I see in the research? What is going on in the research environment, which could be making this less ecologically valid, not similar enough to the real world to apply in real world contexts? Or what things are co-varying in the real world where we can't know causation because there is no control group. There is no alternative reality where you were able to take this rugby athlete and train him differently. Okay, they also have these cultural things. They also have these jobs. They have these travel schedules. So I can't isolate it and say, oh, it's because I instituted this back squat program. What happened when I changed the back squat? And this is where we see the disconnect between volume in the real world and volume in a study. Everything else is controlled in the study. We don't let RIR slip away. We don't change exercise selection. If you can't continue this study or you don't want to try that high volume, you either don't participate or you drop out. So we get this sanitized view over, on average, 10 weeks, if we're talking about the Pella meta-regression, of what happens when we turn up volume and nothing else. People grow more, but man, the more you turn it up, the lower the gain, right? It's diminishing returns. But we don't see that in the real world. Why is that? People go higher volume and sometimes they make worse gains or they burn out. And some people reduce their volume and they do even better. It's because no one almost ever changes just volume in the real world. They go up in volume and they get further from failure. They go up in volume and they get tendinitis and they don't drop out of the study. They just stop training or they get burnout, right? They start changing other things when they go up in volume. Or they were following a very volume-centric science communicator through their novice and intermediate years before they had good technique, before they knew how to train to failure, before they understood effective exercise selection. And now, as a far more experienced lifter, they've learned some new information, had different experiences, and they go down from 20 sets or 25 sets to 15, but they increase the effectiveness of their exercise execution, and they train closer to failure. And they go, hey, I went from 25 sets to 15, I made more gains. But it's not the same comparison. And we also know with that diminishing returns that the 25th, 24th, 23rd, 21st, those sets, even though it's just 5 of them, are way less effective than your 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th, and especially your 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th set. So when you're cutting off these sets that aren't giving you as much return, and then you're making all 15 of the sets you do closer to failure because you have the energy to do so, the experience to do so, and you're making the exercise selection so that they're better targeting those muscles and challenging them in, say, more lengthened position. Does it really surprise anyone that you made better gains, even though you legitimately, quote unquote, decreased your number of sets? You didn't decrease the dose. The dose went up, even though the volume went down. And that's what's really happening when we see these anecdotes. or someone increased their dose too quick, too fast, which we always know is a problem. That's a core tenet of the research on overreaching, overtraining, which never happens in lifting, but still same concept, fitness and fatigue, and our just understanding of the general adaptation syndrome, talking Hans Sale, right? So yeah, if you do a whole bunch of volume before your body is capable of adapting to it, it's not going to go well. And if you increase volume, but you decrease the actual dose of stimulus, yeah, it's not the volume that does it. Volume is the vehicle for the dose. And if you get in a poorer vehicle and lower efficiency, more often than not, you're going to just get the same outcome. You're going to hit this plateauing region where you're increasing sets, but you're not able to actually make it more efficient. But there are some cases, especially when you look back on different phases of a lifter's life, where they were doing far less effective volume earlier in their career, and now they're doing less volume in a far more effective way. And we explain things looking backwards when we have anecdotes. We go, oh, well, that means that volume should go down for advanced lifters because therefore they can put more stress into themselves. It's like, well, what if their workload capacity is increasing? I can handle far more volume at a higher intensity now because I've intentionally done that. And that is the way most fitness adaptations work, right? If you take what will max out the VO2 max response in sedentary older individuals, the cardio program, 3 or 4 times a week at, a moderate intensity, the peak possible gains that these people could make in, say, a 12-week period, and you apply that to a professional cyclist or professional endurance athlete, you give them that same 4-day per week moderate intensity program, their VO2 max will decrease reliably while it is increasing to a maximal level in those sedentary older individuals who are not endurance trained. So that's why we have to understand these things in context. So that was a long answer, but essentially you need to understand all of the different tiers of evidence and how they interact with other things. So just simply teaching somebody that evidence is evidence, but it's constrained to its limitations. Here are the limitations of anecdotal evidence. Here's the limitations of one study that just came out. And here's what your brain does. It's called recency bias, right? And what would you actually need to know to determine this relationship in truth or the closest thing we can get? Well, ideally, you'd want to look at every single study that's for certain criteria, and we would do statistics to get a precise point estimate. And if we don't have that, what's the next best thing? And if we don't have that, what's the next best thing? If we don't have that, what's the next best thing? And if we've got nothing, well, then we have to rely on the best anecdotal evidence we have possible. And that's why I'm a student of history as well, and that's why I take good notes and I'm very meticulous and I use the scientific method, whether I'm in the lab or whether I'm doing coaching, because that way I can still provide an answer to people and I can give them something to do. But critically, can't do this on social media, but I can in a book. I can scale my level of confidence to the strength of the evidence, which is what you won't see. Typically, they're not even using the best evidence. They're using the study that fits their bias or that they're aware of. It's not always necessarily intentional. It could just be wrong. It happens all the time. And then everything is always the most confident thing possible because that's what gets you eyeballs and gives people the sense that you're an expert online.
Yeah, I think one of the sides of science that has probably been not taken out of context, but probably unfairly dismissed by a lot of the naysayers is more of the outcome-based longitudinal type research where they actually have people applying a training principle and seeing what the outcome is. Like obviously the volume studies are a very easy target because I guess like some people can think that the science is trying to tell me what to do and that it's a prescription versus seeing it as something that is conceptual in nature. Obviously the Ennis study where you're doing like the 52 sets of quads, it was never meant to be like we should all do 50 sets of quads now. It's just a case of like, where does the limit exist? Like if you want to see how fast a Ferrari goes, you're going to have to push it beyond what you think it's capable of, right? And it's the exact same with like the human body. And if we just haven't found that limit yet, that should be more options on the table than not. And I think it's just human nature to fall into like camps of like, my way is better than your way and your way is wrong. And I think what I see anyway within the split between, I guess you'd say, real science-based educators, communicators, and those who just want to confirm their bias is, one is putting way too much weight into mechanisms and using that to extrapolate training decisions. And I guess I haven't looked into this myself, right? But I know you probably have some good answers here. What are limitations of taking mechanisms at face value and using those to make training decisions? Because obviously longitudinal research, right? Observational studies, RCTs, they all have limitations. Dirty mechanistic research has its limitations too.
Yeah, the funny thing is if you take mechanisms at face value, that's fine. And then you said to make training decisions. I'm like, well, that's no longer face value.
Yeah.
So I have literally laughed out loud when I've seen certain content creators say, mechanisms over outcomes, because you only have to think for like 3 seconds, in my opinion, or maybe just actually understand how science works, which fair call. If you're not involved in the scientific process, you might not understand this and it may not be obvious. To see that statement is like nonsensical, because how do you study a mechanism, right? And then like, what do you base your hypotheses on? And then how do you confirm if it does the thing you care about? Mechanistic research, which for those who aren't sure what that means, is understanding the physiological process at one of the almost infinite steps along the way, is how we then form hypotheses to do applied research. And most importantly, if you understand the core philosophy of science of how do we actually do research that has resulted in us being able to talk across the world and you listening to this podcast and things like phones to work and planes to fly, is that we create a hypothesis or a model or something becomes robust enough to be a theory by the process of then testing that mechanism to see if the model is correct. You don't just build a house of cards, you got to blow on it and see if it falls over or not. So the thing I often say is that's a testable hypothesis. Like people come up where they look at a physiology textbook and they think, oh, it'd be cool to do this. And I go, yeah, you can test that. So do it, or look for the research that does it. That's how GLP-1 agonists were created, right? Man, it'd be really nice if this incretin that we secreted would stick around longer and make us feel satiated in the obesity environment. Probably help with diabetes and obesity, yeah? Cool, let's just make it and give it to everybody. No. We have to test, is this safe? Does it last long enough? Does it cause nausea? What are the side effects? We need phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials. I'm not going to invest $50 billion into producing this until we've invested maybe a couple $1 million into some trials. Oh, look at that. That's actually what every regulatory agency in any developed world asks for, right? So, oh, shit. Yeah, well, if we get this lizard version that sticks around, we can actually synthesize it in a lab and make what are now completely changing the face of obesity medication. You don't just go, hey, well, you know what? These insulin mimetics, they create satiety. So here's what we need to do is just eat more fiber, and that'll be just as effective as a GLP-1. I'd say, well, that's a testable hypothesis. Why don't you give people GLP-1s and fiber and see if it's compared? And you go, I don't want to do that. That sounds hard. But I can easily sell you a book on the GLP-1 diet, which is literally just eat more vegetables, right? And it'll probably work and it'll help you, and that's how I go to sleep at night while taking your money. Like, that's just the grift, right? And I think some people come by it honestly. They don't realize it's a grift. And it's also really helpful from a psychology and behavior, like science perspective, to use mechanisms, because it makes the grift easy, right? So here's the first thing. Demonstrate expertise, right? I've shown you that I understand these mechanisms, whether I do or not, but I understand how to talk about them in a way that is more than you know and is sufficiently accurate to not get completely called out in some cases. In other cases, maybe I just get it wrong, like the carbohydrate insulin model, but I can get a camp around me, right? I can cite some stuff that supports that mechanism or that physiological outcome, and then I can just ignore whichever data doesn't back it up, and then I can leverage it even more. Guess what? I can use the psychology of how do we perceive expertise and knowledge and manipulate that. You know why React content does so well, especially in the fitness industry, is because you can give the same factual information. And if you are doing it in a way that first critiques someone else who says something different, you're rated as being more intelligent and more likely to be factually correct, more of an expert, than if you just said the same thing in a prescriptive way without attacking someone else first. So all I have to do is find some quote unquote idiot who's saying the wrong thing, or what I can position as the wrong thing, and then say the same thing I would anyway, with them playing in the background, and you'll think I'm smarter. And you're more likely to buy my stuff, right? Then I can leverage scarcity, I can leverage fear, all the things that were creating the whole reason I made the pyramids in the first place. And I don't have to actually test my hypotheses. I can just be like, hey, don't you know that cholesterol forms the basis of all hormones? And actually, the reason why your testosterone is so low and why you're not making any gains is because you're on a low cholesterol diet. You actually need to eat more cholesterol. And everything your doctors have told you is wrong. And now they've looped you in. You're like, oh, I know something. I'm an expert. And there's an element in conspiracy theories that the appeal of having secret knowledge, of feeling like you're the smartest person in the room, these things persist. And then the conspiracy theorists make themselves poor critical thinkers moving forward, because it often comes with poisoning the well. You feel like you're the iconoclast. You're going against the grain, right? And then you start to go, well, we can't trust the quote unquote mainstream or the globalists or the medical establishment or the corporate influence or the political influence or the scientists in the ivory tower. And all of a sudden now you've taken these systematic approaches, especially if you're going against quote unquote science, where we have for actually creating a hypothesis, testing it, becoming more robust to become a model, testing that model, it becomes an actual theory, and then basing training. And you're going, what do they know? These PhDs, mechanisms over outcomes. All we need to do is this mechanism. And how many times have we been wrong because of that approach, right? Short rest periods because it spikes growth hormone. The carbohydrate insulin model. Fasted training because fat oxidation is higher, even though it doesn't have an impact on body comp, right? You have to have protein immediately because I was looking at NPS studies, but not actual hypertrophy long term. This isn't like, it's laughable to anyone who's watched the progression of science over the years. If you want to look at what are all the foibles and the things that we've gotten wrong in exercise science and science broadly and nutrition science, it's when we over extrapolated on a mechanism. And now people who aren't even in the science community are doing it with infographics because they want to sell you something, right? And sometimes these people have literally never done science and they pitch that as an advantage. These PhDs are too siloed. They don't know anything, you know? And I found that hilarious that depending upon the person I'm talking to and the strategy they take to not address the claim, but do an ad hominem attack so they can dismiss me, they'll decide to either position me as a pencil neck nerd who's knee deep in the science and doesn't know anything about training, or if they're more academically minded and they disagree with the science I put forth, he's just a stupid powerlifting coach. Like, well, it's this guy. He's got an IPF world's coaching thing on the wall. Where's his PhD? I'm like, well, actually, that's over here. You know, I have both. So you can choose which one you want, but they don't cancel each other out, you know? So it happens all the time. And it's all just goalpost shifting and strategies to maintain or confirm one biases. And it's not necessarily always disingenuous. I think some people are blinded by their own conflicts of interests and their own hype. And it is challenging for them to change a worldview. When you've constructed a model and it all makes sense, to find out that perhaps everything you built your philosophy on is wrong, it's much easier to retreat into cherry-picking data and focusing on the mechanisms, because the mechanisms can lead you anywhere. But ultimately, you have to test them. That's what science is for. We form a hypothesis and we test it. You don't do that, it's no longer science, period. So by focusing on mechanisms over outcomes, you have opted out of empirical data. You've opted out of the consensus of actually how science occurs. If you said that to the researchers who published the paper on that mechanism that you talked to, they would think you were a moron every single time, right? You don't go to Stu Phillips and say, hey, you know, you did that awesome study in your lab where you looked at muscle protein synthesis response to different types of protein. And I've ignored all the data on lean body mass changes, even that your lab has done with training. And I'm just going to follow those protein recommendations and extrapolate it to my nutrition protocol. He would like shake you and be like, what are you doing? Like we also published this meta-regression 2022 on protein intake and the impact on lean body mass, not the muscle protein synthesis that should lead to lean body mass. You're like 4 steps away. And I think that there's problems with this. It's not even measuring skeletal muscle mass. And you're going to just have 20 grams of protein every 3 hours because of that? Like, what are you talking about? That's not what we would say. Please look at this study that we've done. No. I only look at mechanisms. And now you're talking to the mechanistic researcher who's trying to like bring you back to sanity. So yeah, it is a unfortunate position for someone to hold. And it's very obviously a retreat into, I want to be able to say whatever I want to say. I don't want to change my models, and I don't want to be wrong. And I will keep selling you the same thing, or feeling superior, because ego oftentimes comes into it as well.
Yeah, like I didn't have any formal background in like sports science. I didn't like study it in college. Like I started as a person, like started like reading like the Busted Train Viewers first of all, and Lyle McDonald, all that crowd at the time. And then I started to study to be a personal trainer. And I remember when I started learning about mechanisms, physiology, early on, and I was like, oh my god, all of this starts to make so much sense. And I started to like use it in content, speaking about all these different things to clients who didn't give a fuck. You know, felt like it was extremely smart. I had secrets, especially when I learned about the menstrual cycle.
Yes, sir.
But I guess like the further along, you know, of more experience I've gained, the more I've read, especially like being a subscriber to Mass, you know, and seeing how you guys put together the articles and like, you know, put everything in context with, you know, the mechanistic research, and then like some more kind of outcome based data, and like what it means for, you know, so you mentioned protein there, right? And you know, protein is definitely one of those things where I've had to like update my model on regards to like meal timings and like protein servings, because we don't just consume amino acids, we consume meals, right? And that's all going to impact digestion time. Whereas I still remember to this day when I was like 17 years old, screaming at my mom on the phone to pick me up from the gym because I was gonna miss my 30-minute post workout window, you know, and like to think at the time that was driven off the fact of like, this is an extremely important time when you're really sensitive to muscle protein synthesis spike or whatever the dogma was at the time. But I think every trainer, coach, trainee probably comes for full circle at some point where they kind of realize everything they were probably doing before they learned about all this like fancy stuff was the stuff that they will continue to do and continue to get gains with, versus hyper focusing on, you know, the intricacies, because I do think the intricacies do ultimately limit people, and they, as I said earlier on in the podcast, that they remove options from people. You know, if it's just a case that you can only do 4 to 8 reps, and anything other than that, suboptimal hypertrophy. If you're getting the most return from one set, why would you even bother doing a second set or a third set? You know, and like these arguments, like they ultimately do end up contradicting each other. Like I seen a post the other day talking about, I was using EMG data, how if you do a lateral raise and an overhead press with your like arms and the hands in the overhand position, that's redundant, and that having with them within the same session is probably not going to be good for growing your side delts. And I was like, volume needs are still a thing. So if you're just saying just do one set of delts in a session to grow your side delts, speaking to a bodybuilder, it's not going to lead them to having the best delts on stage. Never mind.
Also,
yeah.
Also external rotation of the humerus is a thing too.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's front delt.
100%.
And usually it's worse.
I think one thing that might really help people understand the importance in the relationship here is it's like you never should be positioning outcomes versus mechanisms. So in actual research, we have mechanistic or bench research. Bench meaning like you're doing it on a bench. It's basic. You're looking at something in a petri dish, maybe an animal model. You're doing surgery on an animal after you had it in a very controlled environment. And it moves from isolated, reductionist, less ecologically valid to what we call applied or translational research, which is meant to be applied or translate to practice. And in translational or applied research, it's a nice bonus if you can include some mechanistic work alongside it, so you can get an idea of why what you observed happened. Likewise, in some mechanistic data, especially in larger publications that are a little more renowned and bigger grants, you might have like an animal study, a cell culture study, and then one RCT that are all published in the same thing. You know, it might happen like a Cell or a Nature. And you're like, hey, we looked at the epidemiological data of the relationship between LDL and the risk of dying of heart attacks with these controlled factors. Then we took these genetically bred mice, and in one group, we created a gene knockout where they had to have higher LDL, really, really high. And then we observed them over their lifespan, and we saw like plaque accumulation because we actually dissected them, right? And who had more plaque accumulation, and would therefore we'd think they would actually die. But now we've moved a step away. No one had a heart attack. None of those rats did. And the first one we did, but there's so many confounders. So there's a limitation there. There's a different limitation here. We're assuming that plaque development increases risk of heart attack. Okay. So, and then the next one we go, okay, then we did an RCT where we controlled intake of cholesterol and saturated fat, or we put people on a statin. And then we saw over time with, some imaging techniques, and looking at other and their lipid profile, who had lower LDL and who appeared to have lower plaque accumulation. And then with those three together, we have covered the entire line of observational, interventional, mechanistic, non-population specific, aka you're not a genetically bred mouse, to applied translational research. But each one is getting away from causational, confirmatory, we're 100% sure it is there, but gets closer and closer and closer to practice. Like, you probably don't want your doctor to turn you into a mouse and then dissect you to see if you're going to have a heart attack. You might prefer to take a statin or change your diet, right? That's something we can actually use. And the same thing is true when you read applied exercise science studies, right? All I got from my lab is I got calibrated plates, I got this handheld portable ultrasound, and I got some powerlifting exercise science students and bodybuilders who know how to do real good measurements of muscle thickness and real accurate 1RMs, and I got the velocity tracker. Right, that's all I got. Okay, cool. Well, let's train these guys a certain way, and hopefully some gals too, or only gals because we were missing some data on them. Maybe we want to look at the menstrual cycle, like you said, and we're going to see what happens to muscle thickness and strength at the same time. We don't have any mechanistic way to confirm why what we saw happened, but you will see a discussion of mechanisms and citing mechanistic research specifically in two places. One, the hypothesis. You go, hey, based upon these mechanisms, we think it was a really good idea to try to do this protein supplementation or this eccentric overload protocol based upon what we observe in, muscle stiffness and what we think that's going to do for a counter movement jump or what have you. Like having protein within this window after this training protocol, we think is going to help because of this mechanistic data on muscle protein synthesis that was a 16-hour study and this data on rats, right? So it justifies the hypothesis to do research based upon that hypothesis to see if it plays out in the real world. And then you get your results. Things happened, and they often don't go the way you expected, or they do go the way you expected. And then in the discussion, you'll see, okay, here's what we saw, and here's probably why, but we don't know for sure. Here's what could have happened based upon these existing mechanisms. Or it went the opposite way. Maybe it was this other thing based upon this mechanistic study. So applied research absolutely will, boom, boom, in those two spots, cite mechanistic data to try to figure out what happened. So it's critically important. And when it doesn't line up, you either know that the mechanism is inaccurate, it's not the only one, it was too reductionist, or something else more important masks it or confounds it in the real world. So we need to do a new study, and then they have a recommended section for future research. So in the mechanistic studies, they're saying another similar thing, but on the other side of the spectrum. If they don't have that whole cell or nature thing where it's a multi-experiment study that includes the whole chain of research, they're just doing the mechanistic work, just the isolated petri dish biopsy data, right? They're looking at that, or just the knockout genetically mutated mice study. They'll say at the end, future research is needed to confirm how this would operate in more ecologically valid conditions. Almost every single time you're going to see that. They're going to state their limitations, and they're going to say how this might apply to the real world. And if it's super, super, super mechanistic and way divorced, they won't even say any of that. Because guess what? You said, how do we take mechanistic? What's the issue with taking mechanistic data at face value? There's no issue with that, because face value does not include making an applied interpretation. All we know for sure is that we've confirmed that the mechanistic target of rapamycin is the primary driver, but not only driver of muscle protein synthesis. How do I take that and then tell you how to train? You can't. You shouldn't. It's not what it's designed for. And that's why the researchers make no attempt literally to do so in those highly mechanistic studies. And why you read them and you're like, I don't know what I'm reading. Like, what is AKT? Like, what? What is IL-6? You know, so and that's the point, is that mechanistic research is then used by someone else higher or lower up in the chain of research or the same area of research to better understand how things operate in the body, so that public health nutritionists, researchers, or exercise scientists or sports science researchers can go, aha, maybe that's a target for an intervention, or one of the reasons to target a certain intervention or develop a drug, right? And then the applied research becomes the thing that confirms its utility, or maybe it has a redundant thing, or it only applies in a genetic knockout mouse. Oh, they metabolize BCAA differently. Oh, they metabolize fructose differently. Well, I guess the carbohydrate insulin model should be rejected, right? That's the whole point. All we can ever do is reject hypotheses. We can't know what's true, right? We can get closer and closer to the truth by chipping away. This is empiricism 101, Karl Popper, right? If we start with an assumption of what is true, what if we're wrong? Are all swans white? Well, yeah, if you've never left Europe. But if you go to Australia for the first time and you find your first black swan, and you started with the assumption of truth that hadn't actually been tested, now you have to modify your model, and that's what a good scientist does. All European swans are white, but some swans are black, right? And that is the entire foundation of empiricism, which is falsification. So I'm totally fine in the absence of good applied or translational data, randomized controlled trials, for someone to say, hey, all we've got is mechanistic data and anecdotal observations. So I think this. And I go, great, that's a testable hypothesis. Now let's run it. Let's do it. And that's what I've done for my 14 years as a researcher. So when people just go, let's just skip that step, I'm like, so that's not science. Period. I don't care what you want to call yourself. It is simply not being evidence-based. That is going, man, I like this pathway. How many pathways are there in that metabolic chain? Oh, a couple million. Okay, cool. We'll just go with that one because you like it, or you heard of it. So hopefully that helps people understand the role of mechanistic data, that anyone who positions mechanisms versus outcomes run the other way. They do not know what they're talking about, or they don't care, and they're trying to sell you something.
Yeah, I guess like the whole hierarchy of evidence, it is working together, and I guess that's why papers are written the way they are written, right? Like they list the hypothesis, they list the methods, they list the results, so that if another group maybe doesn't either agree with how the results turned out, or they think they could have done better methods, or the findings, again, they maybe didn't think they were correct, then it can be replicated. And as you said, right, it's not like you're trying to prove something to be true. You're just looking to reduce uncertainty, and that's all
you're trying to prove it wrong. Quite literally. You were taught to disconfirm your hypotheses when you were an empirical quantitative researcher. And I think that might sound like a weird nuanced distinction, like, oh, not guilty versus innocent. But just like a lawyer would pin you down and say, no, that's a really important distinction. I'm going to pin people down and say, no, this is a really important distinction. We're not trying to find what's true. We're trying to be, closer to being right by being less wrong incrementally over time. It's because we literally can't find out what's true with a single experiment. We can get estimates and probabilistic findings, and we can, like, the theory of gravity is still a theory, right? But I'm pretty damn sure that I'll drop that ball and it'll fall. But as soon as we get outside of a gravity well, the theory of gravity becomes more complex. I mean, we operated off Newtonian physics for the longest time until we needed to go to the moon, or we wanted to launch satellites. And, people who are like on social media saying the earth is flat, I find that pretty funny, because they require a round earth to be using their phone for anyone to read it who's not next to them reading their screen, right? But nonetheless, so the philosophy, though, that underlies that idea of being progressively less wrong over time and falsification rather than trying to find truth is something that non-scientists can take home. And it's a really important lesson. And if you take one thing from this podcast, is that if you have beliefs, try to figure out if you're wrong. Search for evidence that controverts it. You'll be doing something different than 90% of people in the world, because most people, when they have strong beliefs, they're attached to their values, they're attached to the way they see the world, they're sometimes attached to how they see themselves after the world ends. Their religion, their belief about creation, their soul. These are reasons why we have debates and why you don't bring up like religion or politics at the dinner table, is because when you try to seek out truth there, you're butting up against people's identities and their values and their true existential reality, the way that they feel safe in the world. And we're nothing if not survival machines. And we have to respond to threats. And while we don't get chased around by tigers anymore in the first world, we still respond that way. And as soon as we're responding in a knee-jerk emotional reaction and you feel your blood boil and your heart rate's up and you're angry, it's actually literally shutting off parts of your critical thinking brain. But most people do not want to go and search out, okay, I have this belief. Let me look if I can prove it wrong. Because if you can prove it wrong, that means you need to update your model. You need to update your hypothesis. You can find a million white swans, but as soon as you find one single black swan, you have to change your belief that all swans are white. But most people would say, nope, that's a crow. All swans are white because for some reason, whatever the topic is, I've created a group identity, a personal identity, a financial conflict of interest, or I don't want to be publicly wrong because I position myself as an expert or a guru, or I'm, whether I realize or not, quite literally existentially afraid of a world that is different than I thought it was so massively that I don't want to be wrong because it makes me scared. It makes me feel unsafe. It makes me feel out of control. And especially among bodybuilders, we love our control, right? That is a threat. And it puts you into a part of your brain that doesn't promote critical thinking. You're thinking fast, not slow, according to Daniel Kahneman, right? So people will say, no, that's not a swan. That's a crow. That's a vulture. That's something other than what you said, because I am not ready to accept that I live in a world where there are black and white swans. You can apply that to the eccentric. You can apply that to the insulin response to carbohydrate and its relationship with fat mass gain. You can apply that to the risks associated with being in class 1, 2, or 3 obesity with all-cause mortality. All the debates that we see often come down to an unwillingness for people to actively seek out, how can I find the ways that I'm wrong, rather than seeking out what supports me being right. And that's why, for example, empirical sciences, the quantitative world, where we study numbers and we try to see what changes and we run experiments on people, have this underlying empirical philosophy. And why something like, say, geology, where they don't use stats and they do not run experiments, because you can't run a 4 billion year-long experiment to see if the Earth would form the same way with different types of, crusts or magma action. They have to do this forensic back modeling, right? So if you take an approach that you learned as a geologist to exercise science, you will inadvertently create a model that is potentially wrong if you're looking at just the studies that you like, So that's just an example. You have to use the right philosophical approach to the task at hand. And for anyone who is a trainer, regardless of whether you're ever going to do even a bachelor's degree, this is something you can learn from science, more important than any single study or even many studies in a meta-analysis. Is try to find how you were wrong. Try to disprove yourself, and you will get closer and closer to being right, because we all have false beliefs. Science is evolving for that reason. And if you get annoyed by science evolving, just think if it hadn't evolved. We'd still be trying to treat your issue of black bile with bleeding you, right? We would say, oh, you got lead poisoning? No worries. Let me just give you mercury poisoning to sort that out still, right? So the evolution of science, what a doctor would say today compared to 1890, it's not a problem. This is not a bug. It's a feature in the app that has changed. So don't get frustrated with scientists flip-flopping, because we're getting closer and closer to truth. And sometimes we take wrong directions. We should have gone right when we went left. And that happens. It's a slow process. It's a biased process. And there's journals that get in the way, and financial conflicts of interests, and time that just passes faster than our society is suffering. And it's not great, but it's the best tool we got.
It was extremely insightful. I've got one question though when it comes to this, okay? I guess you talked about trying to prove yourself wrong, right? And naturally, people are predisposed to wanting to confirm their bias, and as I said, prove themselves right. what do you think are, what would you say are some important steps in trying to engage that process when it does come to, you know, we talk, use any examples, but we maybe talk about training context.
Yeah. So I think one is understanding the limitations you have to your degree of science literacy. It's one thing for me to say, hey, you should use the most latest meta-regression, but what if meta-regression was done wrong? What if the inclusion criteria wasn't appropriate? What if you read the methods and you're like, I literally have no idea what you're talking about. All I saw was meta-regression, you know, and you don't know what journal it's published in. You don't know the quality of peer review. That's tough, right? But if you do know that you're looking for the consensus, then what you can do is look for something that is on a similar tier of evidence called a systematic review, or you can look at reputable evidence-based organizations that are relatively devoid of conflict of interest and their position stance. Like, for example, the NSCA or the ISSN, or some of these professional organizations that their mandate is to help practitioners do a better job as a registered dietitian or a physical therapist or a doctor. They're not government organizations. They have journals attached to them, so they have independent blind peer review. And if you look at their position stands, they're often done in the same way as a systematic review, which is doing everything that a meta-regression does. We find all the studies, we look at it, we rate it, we create a table, we follow certain guidelines that are academic organizations that are, you know, not for profit are saying, here's how you do systematic reviews to make sure you're the most right possible, like Prisma or Cochrane, right? These are things you might see in the methods. And then you have to go through that process. So you make sure you found all the studies that meet your inclusion criteria, and you have a team of people and a checklist where you can look at the risk of bias for each study, and you have to report it all. So it becomes really hard to just promote your pet theory in a systematic review, and especially position stand when you have 15 other people who are doing it with you. That one guy who is really infatuated with, you know, intermittent fasting, the other 14 people are going to be like, Tom, and that's not a real person. I'm just saying this. I get it, but you're really focusing on just this one data. We're not going to let that fly. So like the ISSN position stands on various things that are the most up to date. Don't just choose the one in 2014 because you like what they said about HMB or whatever. Like choose the one that came out like last year or the most recent. If you look at the athletic trainer, ATC, they have a journal of athletic training. What are they saying? The Journal of Strength Conditioning Research is attached to the National Strength Conditioning Association. The ACSM, the American College of Sports Medicine, they have one of the top ranked journals in exercise physiology, medicine and science, and sport and exercise, right? These things exist. So you want to look at systematic reviews so you don't have to wade through the stats. And what is their qualitative overall interpretation? They're often open access. Look at the most up to date. So you can look at the ACSM guidelines for lifting, NSCA guidelines for lifting, the ISSN guidelines for various things related to nutrition and sports nutrition. These things are really robust, and they go through multiple rounds of peer review. Or the most recent published peer-reviewed textbook by one of these organizations. Now, textbooks expire, so do systematic reviews. Individual studies don't, but they only give you a small snapshot. It's like, you know, the 30 blind men who are trying to describe an elephant. One touches the tail, they think it's a snake. One touches the trunk and says, no, it is a snake, but it's a really big snake. It's an anaconda. And one touches the hoof and goes, oh, it's a rhino. Like, those are all understandable things for them to think, but they only have a small piece of the picture. You need them all combined. And you need them combined in a way that doesn't create a potential error, like in interpretation or the actual process of doing it. And you won't be able to gauge that because you don't know the stats, right? So I think that's one thing, that even if you're a non-scientist, you can't access some of this information. And then even if that is a little opaque to you, or you can't access it because you're not part of a university, or you're just not super savvy with reading like the kind of high-level academic stuff, there are great research reviews that people who write those same papers do, and not to self-serve, but mass research review, which you brought up. You know, you've got Professor Mike Zerdos, who runs the muscle lab at Florida Atlantic University and is head of department there, and is a squatted 500 pounds, was a national level competitive powerlifter, and has coached people all the way to world and national titles in powerlifting, and has been a professional SNC coach. He's a world leading authority on resistance training, right? You've got Lauren Colenso Semple, who was in Stu Phillips' lab doing her PhD out in McMaster. And she was getting her master's with Bill Campbell, who's doing the most, forward, like physique athlete specific work, and has done internships with folks who are doing biopsies and looking at changes in muscle fiber typing, like Andy Galpin. And she's been a personal trainer for years and has had her own very high level goal. So they have both sides of the coin. And you got Trexler, who has been a competitive bodybuilder, and to give him a nod, also a competitive classic physique competitor, double pro in both, the Deion Sanders of the natural bodybuilding world. But he's also a lecturer and a postdoctoral fellow, along with many other top scientists at Duke University, right? He's done a PhD and he's an expert in physiology and nutrition. Now he's branched out and he's doing even more work in metabolism and understanding, physiological changes in various contexts, right? So, and I've already talked about myself, but the point is that the four of us work together to write mass. So that we're going to have both the practical and the scientific understanding, and we peer review each other, right? And we put it out. So we're on the internet, so like we have the opportunity to get critiqued and respond to it. And we are paranoid about being wrong because that's why we always try to prove ourselves wrong, to make sure that we're as right as we can be given the information available. So that's the first step, is looking at those sources of information and making sure that you're reducing the probability that as a non-expert, or the degree of an expert you can be given your training, that you're unlikely to be wrong. And then the next step is just to actively think in a way that is trying to prove yourself wrong. And a really powerful question is, what would the world need to look like if this was true, or if this was false? So some of these claims, like you said, they prove themselves wrong quite readily. What would the world look like if you could only train in the 4 to 8 rep range to grow muscle? How are these people getting huge? Is it all drugs? What about these natural bodybuilders? What would the world look like if one set to failure every fortnight was the optimal way to train, and it was that obvious? Wouldn't bodybuilders all be kind of training a similar way? And you can check this. Like, all right, well, what's the most recent survey on hundreds of drug-free and enhanced bodybuilders, and how do they train? What is the mean number of sets that are done by the bell curve of the population? If you think that high volume or low volume is that good, where it's obvious, then the people who are doing everything in their power to get as big as possible surely would have landed on this, or there's no value in listening to In the Trenches experience anyway. Well, interesting. They're doing 12 to 24 sets, direct sets on average, not even counting fractional. They're not doing really low volume, and not everyone is doing really, really high volume. What does that tell us about the data? Okay, so higher volumes are better, but going crazy high is not the same thing as doing it for 10 weeks in a study for 2 muscle groups as it is for your entire 20-year lifting career trying to do, 30 sets for all muscle groups simultaneously, which is why even translational research tells you about principles. It's not necessarily prescriptive. So that type of thing is really powerful. What would the world need to look like if that were true? If the world was flat, how would things operate? Wouldn't we see the edge of it when we took plane rides, right? Like, these types of questions are easy. It doesn't take you needing to read the methods section of, a study published in Nature. Okay, well, if the eccentric is actually worse than the concentric, then how does eccentric only training fare? Let me just look at a few quick position statements and systematic reviews. Well, hold on. The entire consensus is that they're neutral to positive in favor of concentric only training. So maybe this content creator who's saying the eccentric is actively detracting from your muscle growth doesn't know what he's talking about, or is over leveraging a mechanism, as one example.
I think that final point, like, what would the world look like? It's a extremely helpful one, because as you said, like, a lot of people won't have, well, they might not have the time to read a systematic review because they can be pretty damn meaty, or just like they know how, like, they might get even more confused after reading one, But I think just that little heuristic, you could say, like, what would it look like, is an extremely helpful one. Eric, I've taken up nearly 2 hours of your time. I really, really appreciate you spending time here today with me, and hopefully making everybody who's listening a little bit more of a deeper thinker.
I hope so too, and I really appreciate the platform. Thanks again. It's always great to talk, Shane.
Where have you got the books hosted? So
muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. That's where you can get them digitally. And if you want to get them physically, Amazon.com. That's, I don't know if you've heard of that company. They're a small startup that is trying to work on, selling a few things, like literally everything you could ever want anywhere in the world delivered by drones. But yeah, no, in all seriousness, yeah, we've got physical versions. You can get hardcover or soft cover, depending upon paperback. I guess that's what people call it these days. Where you are, depending upon your region. But yeah, you can get the digital books, muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. You can get the bundle together there for a little bit cheaper, or if you go through Amazon, there's individual books, and it would be an honor and a pleasure for you to read them, because my brain is trying to solve problems, and I would love it if I solved all the issues we talked about just by getting everyone a copy of my books. But that's apparently not how it works, because I'm on the 3rd edition, and we're still having more problems than we did when we start.
I'll leave the link to that in the description on YouTube and Spotify, as well as the link to all your socials. But yeah, I hope you did enjoy the podcast. Please do leave me a rating on the podcast platform you're listening on. Go over to Eric's page, give him a follow if you haven't already. Buy his books, you won't be disappointed. And yeah, we will chat to you in the next one.